I want you to close your eyes for just a second, assuming you're not driving, obviously.
Right. Please keep your eyes open if you're behind the wheel.
Yeah, safety first. But I want you to imagine you are standing on the incredibly rugged, misty coast of Devon, down in the southwest of England.
It's a very atmospheric place.
It really is. And it's dusk. The air is freezing, just biting at any exposed skin, and the English Channel right in front of you is entirely blanketed in this thick, suffocating fog.
Yeah.
The ocean is completely silent. But then as you look out into that gray, swirling void, you see something. Just a shadow at first.
Like a trick of the light.
Exactly, a trick of the light. But it becomes this spectral silhouette, gliding completely silently through the water. It has these towering wooden masts, billowing square sails, and the unmistakable, aggressive, heavy profile of a 16th century warship.
It's just a terrifying thing to see looming out of the fog.
Oh, your heart would just stop in your chest. You'd have to ask yourself, is this a hallucination? Is it brought on by the absolute isolation of this coastline? Or are you looking at the legendary phantom of the Golden Hind?
It is an incredibly chilling image to start us off, and it's an image that has genuinely, it's haunted the British coastline for centuries.
Really? Like people actually report seeing this?
Oh, absolutely. People have reported seeing exactly what you just described. A ghost ship, perfectly preserved in its Elizabethan glory, just slipping through the fog and then vanishing without a single trace.
Wow.
It's a vision that taps into our absolute deepest maritime fears, I think. That inherent human sense of the ocean as this ancient, unforgiving place that just, it holds on to its dead.
Yeah, and that feeling of dread, that pure maritime horror, is exactly where we are planting our flag today. We're going to explore the incredibly dark, suspenseful, and honestly awe-inspiring historical reality behind this ghostly legend.
It's quite the story.
It is. We are doing a deep dive into the true story of the Golden Hind, which was the first English ship to ever circumnavigate the globe between 1577 and 1580. And for anyone listening who thinks this is just going to be, a dusty history lesson about an old wooden boat, let me stop you right there.
Yeah, this isn't just a museum piece. Far from it.
Yeah.
We really have to approach this story not just as a triumphant historical footnote, which is, well, it's how it's usually taught.
Right.
We need to see it as a genuine, real-life survival story, a true maritime horror story in many ways.
I completely agree.
Because the reality of what happened out there on the water is far more terrifying, and it demands far more sheer human endurance than any ghost story could ever hope to be.
So if you are listening to this on your commute right now, or maybe taking a walk, I want you to put yourself in the shoes of the men we are going to talk about today.
It's hard to even imagine.
It really is. This vessel survived a brutal 36,000-mile journey into the literal unknown. It is a ship that sparked a global empire, pulled off what can only be described as the absolute heist of the century, and survived conditions so horrifying that its physical wood eventually became venerated as sacred relics.
It was a crucible, in the truest sense of the word. The men on that ship faced freezing waters, unmapped and entirely hostile oceans, scurvy, starvation.
Just complete isolation.
Right, the absolute psychological terror of total isolation. And they did it all in an era where just stepping onto a ship in the first place was, statistically speaking, basically a coin toss with death.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we get into the blood and the freezing seawater and the stolen silver, I need to understand the world that birthed this voyage in the first place.
We have to set the stage.
Yeah, we are in the 1570s. And from the sources we're looking at, the political landscape seems like an absolute powder keg.
Oh, it is a powder keg. And it has a very short, very frayed fuse. You have Queen Elizabeth I and the English crown locked in this incredibly tense, high-stakes proxy conflict with the Spanish Empire.
And Spain is huge at this point, right?
Spain at this time is an absolute behemoth. They are pulling vast, almost unimaginable amounts of wealth out of the Americas.
Like silver and gold.
Specifically silver and gold. And England is feeling the immense pressure of that expanding Spanish power. It's essentially a Cold War that is constantly threatening to boil over into a hot war.
Which it eventually does.
Exactly, culminating in the Anglo-Spanish War.
Wait, let me pause you there, though.
Yeah.
When we say proxy conflict or Cold War in the 1570s, What does that actually look like on the ground? Or on the water, I should say. I mean, there are no nuclear deterrents here.
That's a crucial point. It looked like plausible deniability.
Oh, no.
England and Spain were officially at peace. They had ambassadors in each other's courts. But beneath the surface, Elizabeth was actively, covertly funding operations to sabotage Spanish supply lines.
So she's trying to siphon off that New World wealth.
Precisely. She couldn't send the Royal Navy to attack Spanish ports because that would be a formal declaration of war. So she relied on private individuals to do the dirty work for her.
And right in the middle of this boiling, paranoid tension steps Francis Drake.
Exactly. Drake is given unofficial support by Queen Elizabeth to act as a privateer. Now, privateer is a very polite diplomatic term.
It essentially means a state-sponsored pirate, doesn't it?
It does. It gives him the legal cover, a letter of marque, to commit acts of extreme violence and theft upon the high seas.
But with rules.
Right. Provided he directs those acts exclusively at the Spanish, and provided the English crown gets a hefty cut of the profits.
Naturally.
The explicit public objective given to him was to, quote, find out places meet to have traffic. In other words, to explore new territories and establish trade routes.
But the subtext was much darker. I read this one detail in our sources that actually made the hair on my arm stand up.
Oh, about their meeting.
Yes. Before he even set sail, Drake had a face-to-face meeting with Queen Elizabeth, which was their first ever meeting. And her words to him were chillingly clear. She said, quote, "We would gladly be revenged on the King of Spain for diverse injuries that we have received."
Yeah, we would gladly be revenged. That is not a mandate for peaceful exploration.
Not at all.
That is a hunting license.
It's a mandate for chaos.
Yeah.
She is basically unleashing a weapon of mass disruption onto the oceans. And to execute that mandate, to inflict that revenge, Drake needed a very specific kind of weapon.
The ship.
Right, which brings us to the ship itself, the anatomy of the legend.
Uh-huh.
And the first thing that completely threw me when I was going through the historical records is that this legendary ghost ship, the Golden Hind, didn't even start its life with that name.
No, it didn't.
It was originally named the Pelican.
Yes, a slightly less intimidating moniker for a warship. The Pelican was launched in 1577. It actually wasn't until August 20, 1578, right in the middle of the voyage, that he renamed her.
Right, as they were heading into danger.
Exactly. Just as they were preparing to enter the terrifying and deadly Strait of Magellan at the southern tip of South America, that's when Drake formally renamed her the Golden Hind.
What is the psychology behind renaming a ship mid-voyage? I mean, I always thought sailors considered that incredibly bad luck.
In many maritime traditions, it is considered terrible luck. But Drake's motivation was purely political and financial survival.
Okay, how so?
The new name was meant to honor his principal patron, Sir Christopher Hatton. Hatton was one of the major financial sponsors of this enormously expensive and incredibly dangerous expedition. And Hatton's family crest featured a golden hind, which is a female red deer.
Oh, wow. So he's sailing into what is essentially a death trap, and he wants to make sure the guy writing the checks back home gets his ego stroked.
It was a wildly shrewd move. When you are sailing into the absolute abyss, about to attempt a passage that has killed countless sailors before you, you want to make sure the powerful men funding your survival back in London feel deeply personally invested.
Right.
If the ship bearing your family crest is out there, you are going to use your political influence to protect it.
That makes total sense. But let's get into the physical reality of this ship, because I think this is where the sheer horror of this historical event really starts to set in for me.
It's claustrophobic just thinking about it.
It really is. According to the architectural records we have, it was a galleon, estimated at somewhere between 100 and 150 tons, with most historical experts zeroing in on 120 tons. Its overall displacement was 300 tons. But let's look at the actual dimensions.
They are shockingly small.
Yeah. The length on the deck was 102 feet. But the actual hull length, like the part sitting in the water, was only about 80 feet.
Yes, roughly 24 meters.
And its beam, its maximum width was just 20 to 23 feet.
20 feet wide. That is barely the width of a modern two-lane residential street.
And it had a draft, which is how deep the ship sits down in the water, of between 9 and 13 feet when fully loaded. It had a sail area of 386 square meters.
Quite a lot of canvas for such a small hull.
Right. Its top speed was about 8 knots, which is roughly 15 kilometers an hour. It was heavily armed with 22 cannons. And here's the part that makes my chest tighten just thinking about it. The complement, the crew size. 80 to 85 human beings were packed onto this thing.
It is almost impossible for a modern mind accustomed to personal space and hygiene to comprehend that level of sustained claustrophobia.
I really want to emphasize the absolute absurdity of these numbers for you listening. An 80-foot hull, 102 feet on the deck. If you go to a marina today, a 100-foot boat is a moderate-sized luxury yacht.
Right, it's meant for maybe a dozen people to sip champagne on for a weekend in the Mediterranean.
Exactly. How in the world does a crew of 80 grown men survive on a wooden ship that small? We are talking about venturing into entirely unmapped, wildly hostile oceans without GPS, without modern weather forecasting, without radio.
Nothing.
80 men crammed into an 80-foot wooden box. Where do they sleep? Where do they go to the bathroom?
The short answer is, well, everywhere and anywhere, and in horrifying proximity to one another.
Oh, God.
There were no private quarters for the average sailor. The men slept in shifts, huddled between the cannons on the gun deck, often in hammocks or literally just on the bare, damp wood.
With the ocean just inches away through the planks.
Exactly. The lower decks were incredibly low-ceilinged. A grown man could not stand up straight. It was completely dark, lit only by a few lanterns, and the ventilation was practically non-existent.
The smell must have been a physical force, like a wall hitting you.
Unbearable. You have 80 men who do not bathe. You have rotting food, salted meat turning rancid in the barrels, livestock penned up on the deck, bilge water sloshing in the absolute bottom of the hull.
Ugh, the bilge water.
And the sharp, sulfurous tang of gunpowder, all trapped in this humid, freezing, constantly swaying wooden box.
But here's what I don't understand. If Queen Elizabeth is essentially funding a Black Ops mission against the Spanish Empire, why send such a tiny ship? The Spanish had these massive floating fortresses. Why not build something bigger and heavily armored?
What's fascinating here is that the diminutive size of the Golden Hind wasn't a flaw. It was actually its greatest technological edge.
Really?
Yes. To survive what they were about to face, they didn't need a massive, lumbering fortress. The design of the Golden Hind was heavily based on the Spanish-built now Victoria, which, importantly, was the first ship to ever circumnavigate the globe decades earlier.
Okay, under Ferdinand Magellan and Juan Sebastian Elcano. So they basically reverse-engineered the only ship that had proven it could survive a trip around the world.
In many ways, yes. The Golden Hind represents this absolutely vital technological transition in mid-16th century naval architecture. It's described in our sources as a warship bridging the gap between the older Carrack design and the newer galleon.
Okay, pretend I know absolutely nothing about 16th century shipbuilding. What is the difference between a Carrack and a galleon, and why did it matter for their survival?
Think of the Carrack like an 18-wheeler truck. It was huge, bulbous, very round, and built with incredibly high towering structures at the front and back called castles.
The forecastle and the aft castle.
Right. It was designed purely for carrying massive amounts of cargo or acting as a high platform for soldiers to shoot down from. But because it was so tall and heavy, it was sluggish. It caught the wind terribly, meaning it could easily be blown off course, and it handled horrendously in severe storms.
Because its center of gravity was way too high, right? It would just want to tip over.
Precisely.
So,
Now enter the galleon. If the Carrack is the 18-wheeler, the galleon is a sports car, or rather, a heavily armored sports car.
I love that analogy.
The naval architects lowered those towering castles. They lengthened the hull relative to the width. They sleeked out the lines. The galleon was lower in the water, far more aerodynamic, and had a vastly improved sail rigging system.
So it was built for agility rather than sheer capacity.
Yes. And think about the environment Drake was sailing into. The immense tempests of the southern oceans near Antarctica. Waves down there can routinely reach 60, 70, even 80 feet high.
As tall as the ship is long.
Exactly. The weather changes in a heartbeat. If you are in a massive, rigid, top-heavy Carrack, those rogue waves will literally snap your ship in half or roll it over completely.
But the Golden Hind, because it's only 102 feet long and 20 feet wide, it can ride the swells.
It bobs like a cork rather than resisting the water like a wall. It could ride the crests, it could turn on a dime to avoid uncharted reefs, and crucially for Drake's secret mission, it was fast enough and nimble enough to catch the slower, heavier Spanish treasure ships that were lumbering across the Pacific.
Okay, the mechanical logic makes sense, but the human cost of that agility is just staggering to think about. You are deliberately sacrificing living space and basic human comfort for maneuverability.
It was a brutal trade-off.
You are condemning 80 men to absolute psychological torment. The constant eerie creaking of the wood all around you, day and night. You are sleeping shoulder to shoulder in a damp, freezing environment. And we haven't even touched on the diseases.
Scurvy, dysentery, typhus, they weren't just possibilities. In the 16th century, they were inevitabilities.
I read up on scurvy specifically for this, and it is absolute nightmare fuel.
It's horrific.
It's not just feeling a little tired. Because you have a severe lack of vitamin C, your body stops producing collagen, which means your gums rot and turn black. Your teeth literally fall out of your head. But the most horrifying part is that old healed scars on your body wounds you got years ago will spontaneously dissolve and tear themselves back open.
Yes, because your tissue is literally disintegrating while you were still alive.
And you're experiencing all of that while the ship is pitching wildly at a 45-degree angle, and you are expected to climb 60 feet up the rigging in the freezing rain to pull in a frozen canvas sail.
It sounds less like an adventure and more like a floating prison sentence where the execution is just drawn out over 3 years.
Yeah, that's exactly what it sounds like.
And understanding that psychological pressure cooker is absolutely vital. Every single day was a battle against the elements, yes, but equally a battle against their own rapidly deteriorating minds and bodies. When we talk about the ghost of the Golden Hind appearing in the fog, we have to remember the very real ghosts of the men who actually lived, suffered, and died in that 80-foot hull.
Right.
The sheer discipline required by Francis Drake to keep 80 heavily armed, terrified, starving men from mutinying in the middle of nowhere is staggering.
Well, that discipline, that mechanical agility, and that psychological endurance would be put to the ultimate test almost immediately. Because they didn't just sail out into the ocean and magically find Spanish treasure. They experienced absolute hell before they ever reached their ultimate prize.
They certainly did.
Let's talk about the expedition itself. It started in December 1577. And Drake did not leave England alone. What was the actual scale of this expedition on day one?
The expedition actually set sail with a fleet of 5 ships and a total complement of 164 men. It wasn't a lone wolf operation. It was a small armada. They crossed the Atlantic and reached the Brazilian coast in early 1578.
But it wasn't an easy crossing.
Not at all. The journey across the Atlantic and down the coast of South America was a bloodbath of attrition.
Attrition. That's a very clinical word for what was essentially a slow-motion disaster. 164 men left England. 5 ships. By the time they actually make it through the Strait of Magellan and into the Pacific Ocean, only the Golden Hind is left. Where did everyone else go?
It is the classic horror trope of the dwindling party. You start with a robust, confident group, and the environment just systematically strips you down to nothing.
It just picks them off one by one.
Exactly. 2 of the smaller ships, the Swan and the Christopher, were scuttled, meaning they were deliberately destroyed and broken up by Drake's own men. They were either rotting or so many men had died of disease that they simply didn't have enough crew left to sail 5 ships, so they consolidated.
Which means the surviving men from those ships are now crammed onto the remaining 3, making the claustrophobia even worse.
Precisely. Then, as they enter the Strait of Magellan, they face weather conditions that are almost apocalyptic. The strait is a labyrinth of narrow, freezing channels, violent currents, and sudden, ferocious storms coming off the glaciers.
I can't even imagine navigating that in the dark without a map.
It was deadly. In one of these storms, a ship called the Marigold was lost with all hands.
Just swallowed by the sea.
Gone. 1 minute they are there fighting the waves, and the next they are just gone beneath the black water. Dozens of men vanished.
Oh my God.
And the psychological impact of seeing your sister ship just erased by the ocean cannot be overstated. Shortly after that, the captain of another ship, the Elizabeth, got separated in yet another violent storm, and instead of searching for Drake, he just gave up. The terror was too much. He turned his ship around and sailed all the way back to England.
Let me wrap my head around that. You've crossed the Atlantic, you've survived scurvy, starvation, and storms, and then the second you hit the truly dangerous part, half your remaining friends die and the other half just abandon you.
By the time Francis Drake enters the Pacific Ocean, he is utterly, completely alone. His support system is gone. He has 1 ship left. He is thousands of miles from home, in waters completely unmapped by the English and completely controlled by his sworn enemy, the Spanish Empire.
But they survived the storms. Against all odds, this 120-ton sports car of a ship made it through. And on March 1st, 1579, off the coast of Ecuador, all that suffering, all that terror suddenly paid off in a way they couldn't possibly have imagined.
It was a turning point.
They spotted a lone Spanish galleon, the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción. And this is where the privateer mission, the state-sponsored piracy, comes into full, glorious, terrifying focus.
The Golden Hind challenged and captured the Spanish ship. And what they found in her hold, it defies belief, even today.
But wait, how exactly did an 80-foot English ship capture a massive Spanish galleon? Didn't the Spanish see them coming?
That is the brilliant, terrifying element of surprise. The Spanish considered the Pacific Ocean to be a closed lake. They had an absolute monopoly on it. No English ship had ever made it through the Strait of Magellan before.
Oh, so they weren't even looking for English ships.
Exactly. So when the crew of the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción saw a ship approaching them off the coast of Ecuador, they didn't raise the alarm. They didn't prime their cannons. They assumed it was a friendly Spanish vessel. Why wouldn't they?
They thought it was the mailman, but it was actually a home invasion.
Yes. Drake was able to sail the Golden Hind right up alongside the Spanish galleon before they realized what was happening. By the time the Spanish captain realized it was an English warship bristling with 22 cannons, it was too late.
Wow.
Drake demanded their surrender, fired a few warning shots that took out their mast, and boarded them. It was a flawless tactical strike.
And the haul. Let's look at the numbers from our sources because they are staggering. They captured over 360,000 pesos worth of treasure. That was the largest single treasure captured to that date in human history. To put that in modern terms, the estimates place it equivalent to around 480 million pounds in 2017.
Nearly £500 million captured in a single afternoon.
And we are not talking about paper money or digital wire transfers. We were talking about physical, dense, incredibly heavy metal.
Yes, and the sheer logistics of dealing with that much physical wealth in the middle of the ocean is a nightmare in itself.
Right. The sources say it took them 6 agonizing days just to physically transfer the treasure from the Spanish ship to the Golden Hind. 6 days of backbreaking labor on the open ocean, constantly looking over their shoulders, terrified that the Spanish Armada might show up over the horizon at any second.
It must have been nerve-wracking.
And here is what they were moving, using ropes, pulleys, and brute human strength. 26 tons of silver, half a ton of gold, plus massive chests of porcelain, jewelry, and coins. Later in the voyage, they stopped in the Spice Islands and added another 6 tons of clothes, which at the time were literally worth their weight in gold.
26 tons of silver. I want us to really sit with that physical reality for a moment.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and this is exactly what I wanted to ask you about.
Yeah.
I want you to explain the physics of this to me, because this feels incredibly dangerous. You have a 120-ton ship. It's barely 100 feet long. It's already crammed with 80 men, 22 heavy iron cannons, barrels of water, and whatever rotting food they have left. And you suddenly load 26 tons of dead, lifeless weight into the very bottom of it. How does that change the way a 16th century ship actually sails?
It fundamentally entirely changes the physics and the seaworthiness of the vessel. We talked earlier about displacement and draft.
Let's break those terms down for the listener again.
Certainly. Think of displacement like getting into a bathtub. The water rises because your body pushes the water out of the way. A ship's displacement is the weight of the water it pushes aside, which is equal to the total weight of the ship and everything inside it.
Okay.
The heavier the ship, the more water it has to displace to stay afloat.
And the draft is how deep the ship is pushed down into the water to achieve that displacement.
Exactly. The Golden Hind had a maximum draft of 13 feet. When you suddenly drop 26 tons of dense silver into the hold, you are drastically increasing the displacement. The ship sinks much, much lower into the water. Its freeboard, which is the distance from the waterline to the top of the deck, shrinks perilously.
So the ocean is literally closer to spilling over the sides.
Exactly. And remember why the galleon survived in the first place? Agility. When a wave hits an agile, properly loaded ship, the ship bobs up and rides over it. But with 26 tons of dead weight acting as a massive anchor in your hull, the ship becomes sluggish.
It can't get out of its own way.
It doesn't bob up fast enough. When a massive swell hits, instead of riding over it, the wave crashes directly onto the deck. The ship groans. The wooden timbers literally scream under the opposing stress of the waves pushing up and the silver pulling down. Your margin for error in an environment that regularly kills sailors drops to absolute zero.
It is a terrifying paradox. The very thing they crossed the world to find, the treasure that will make them absolute kings back home in England, is the exact thing that is mechanically most likely to kill them.
Yes.
Put yourself in the shoes of an ordinary sailor on that ship. You are sleeping down in the dark, inches away from 500 million pounds worth of silver. But you can't eat it. It can't keep you warm, can't cure your scurvy. And you know deep in your bones that if a storm hits and the ship goes down, all that silver is going to drag you into the freezing black abyss so fast you won't even have time to take a final breath.
And that profound physical vulnerability is immediately compounded by the psychological terror of what they've just done. They haven't just robbed a ship. They have committed an act of unprecedented geopolitical vandalism against the most powerful empire on Earth.
Right, the Spanish are not going to just let this go.
The Spanish authorities in the Americas are enraged. The alarm has been raised all up and down the coast.
Which means Drake's original escape route is completely cut off.
Precisely. Drake knows he cannot simply turn around and go back the way he came. The Spanish Navy will be waiting for him at the Strait of Magellan. They will blow him out of the water. He is actively being hunted.
So they are entirely trapped. They can't go south, they can't go east. Their only option is to do something almost unimaginably dangerous, to keep going forward into the unknown, to attempt to sail all the way across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, navigate the labyrinth of the Indian Ocean, round the treacherous Cape of Good Hope at the tip of Africa, and sail all the way back up the Atlantic to England.
It wasn't a triumphant exploration at this point. A circumnavigation wasn't just a fun goal to put on a resume. It was a desperate, panicked escape route. It was a flight for bare survival.
Let's paint that picture. They are sitting on a floating mountain of treasure, vastly overloaded, actively leaking thousands of miles from any friendly port, and surrounded by an ocean that mechanically wants to pull them to the bottom, while being hunted by an empire that wants to hang them.
It's the definition of a nightmare.
Every strange sound the wood makes in the dark, every sudden shift in the wind, every cloud on the horizon would have sent spikes of pure, undiluted adrenaline through the crew. The sustained stress over the next year and a half must have been absolute agony.
It is a level of psychological endurance that is difficult to fathom. They are sailing blind into the largest body of water on the planet, hoping they don't hit a reef, hoping the wood holds together, hoping the water barrels don't completely putrefy.
Which makes what happens next almost miraculous. Because despite the immense weight of the silver, despite the rotting hull, despite the diseases and the tempests, they don't sink. They make it. Which brings us to their triumphant return and the birth of an empire.
The survival of the Golden Hind is undeniably one of the great maritime feats in human history. After nearly 3 years of absolute hell, on September 26, 1580, the ship finally sails into Plymouth Harbor in England.
3 years. And we have to look at the human toll here because it is sobering. Out of the 164 men who left England across 5 ships, and out of the roughly 80 men who started specifically on the Golden Hind, only 56 men are left aboard when they pull into Plymouth.
56 spectral, exhausted, profoundly traumatized men. They have sailed 36,000 miles. They have buried their friends on foreign shores or watched them swallowed by the freezing sea. They have endured starvation, thirst, and diseases that make your tissues dissolve. But they survived, and crucially, they brought the treasure home.
The haul was so immense, so ridiculously massive that the Queen didn't even trust it to stay on the docks in Plymouth. Our sources note that it was immediately unloaded and transported to Trevetton Castle nearby under the heavy armed supervision of Queen Elizabeth's personal guards.
Queen Elizabeth recognized immediately that this wasn't just a successful pirate raid. This was a geopolitical earthquake. It completely shifted the balance of power in Europe. She eventually went aboard the Golden Hind herself when it was permanently moored at Deptford on the south bank of the Thames.
Which is a big deal.
Huge. And while she was on the deck of this battered, rotting ship, she did something incredibly calculated. She didn't knight Francis Drake herself. She shrewdly asked the French ambassador to bestow the knighthood on him.
See, that is such a fascinating detail to me. If he is her greatest hero, why outsource the knighthood to a French diplomat?
It's a diplomatic masterstroke. By having the French ambassador perform the ceremony, she is essentially forcing France to publicly endorse Drake's actions against Spain.
Oh, that's brilliant.
It tells King Philip of Spain, it's not just England that celebrates this theft, France is with us too. It was a massive public insult to Spain and a brilliant piece of political theater, staged on the very wooden decks that had survived 36,000 miles of maritime horror.
Let's talk about the money, because the financial impact of this single ship completely altered the trajectory of human history. The Queen's share of the treasure, just her personal cut of the profits, came to at least £160,000.
Which doesn't sound like a lot today, but in 1580, that sum was apocalyptic in its purchasing power.
The sources explicitly spell this out, and my jaw dropped when I read it. That £160,000 was enough to pay off England's entire government debt.
The entire national debt.
Yes, the entire national debt of a major European power, wiped out by the contents of one 80-foot wooden boat. And after paying off the debt, she still had £40,000 left over.
And what she decided to do, that leftover £40,000, is perhaps the most important part of this entire story, historically speaking. She didn't just lock it in a vault. She invested it in a new trading company for the Levant, focusing on trade with the Ottoman Empire and the East.
The analogy I keep coming back to is a modern tech startup.
Yeah.
But imagine instead of coding an app in a garage in Silicon Valley, your startup involved sailing into the literal unknown abyss, committing state-sponsored piracy against a global superpower, enduring years of starvation and psychological terror, and returning with a payload so massive it clears the national debt of a country like the United States.
Right.
And the return on investment. The sources state that the Queen and the other sponsors saw a return of more than £47 for every £1 they invested, a 4,700% return.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that 4,700% return isn't just a fun piece of financial trivia.
Yeah.
It is the genesis of an empire. The capital generated by the horrific suffering of the men on the Golden Hind didn't just pay off debts, it funded the future. That Levant trading company, seeded by stolen Spanish silver and Indonesian cloves, laid the early economic foundations for the great chartered companies that would follow, most notably, the East India Company. The sheer terror and survival endurance of those 56 surviving sailors directly financed the creation of the British Empire's global maritime and trading dominance. The modern world map was essentially drawn with the silver stored in the Golden Hind's leaky belly.
It's staggering to think about the butterfly effect of that one voyage. And because of this monumental, world-changing achievement, Queen Elizabeth knew that she couldn't just strip the ship of its guns, give it no crew, and send it back to work, hauling coal across the channel. She ordered it to be frozen in time.
Yes, she requested that the Golden Hind be placed on permanent display at Deptford. This is widely considered by historians to be the very first example of a museum ship in history. The concept of preserving a vehicle purely for its historical and symbolic significance rather than breaking it down for parts was incredibly novel at the time.
But this is where the reality of time and physics catches up with the legend. You can declare a wooden ship a national monument, but wood rots, especially wood that has been battered by 36,000 miles of saltwater, shipworms, and Antarctic storms. It remained there at Deptford for roughly 70 years, from 1580 to around 1650. That's 45 years after Queen Elizabeth herself died. By the mid-17th century, the ship is just disintegrating in the mud of the Thames.
It's essentially a massive, rotting corpse of a ship. But the cultural memory of what that ship accomplished, the terror it survived, and the wealth it brought back was so powerful that the English public couldn't bear to simply throw the rotten wood into a fire. When the decision was finally made that the ship could no longer be saved and had to be broken up, its timber wasn't treated like scrap, it was treated like holy relics.
Like pieces of the true cross.
Exactly. In 1668, a man named John Davies, who was the keeper of stores at Deptford, salvaged the absolute best remaining timber from the disintegrating hull of the Golden Hind, and he had it crafted into a piece of furniture that is now known as the Drake chair.
And he presented this chair to the Bodleian Library at the University of Oxford, where it still remains today. There's also a replica of it at Buckland Abbey, maintained by the National Trust.
And the chair isn't the only piece of the ship that survived this way, right?
No, there is also a table known as the cupboard in the Middle Temple Hall in London, which is reputed to be made from the wood of the Golden Hind. To this day, when new members are called to the bar when they officially become lawyers, they sign the roll of members upon this specific cupboard. Furthermore, the ship's actual lantern was hung in the vestibule of Middle Temple Hall, though tragically, that specific relic was destroyed during the bombings of the Second World War. So what does this all mean? I have to point out how objectively bizarre this human behavior is. We take a terrifying weapon of war, a ship that was the site of immense suffering, disease, isolation, and violence. We let it rot in the mud for 70 years, and then we chop it up to make furniture for lawyers and academics. I liken it to taking the Apollo 11 command module, The spacecraft that took humanity through the terrifying vacuum of space to the moon, letting it rust in a field in Florida for a century, and then ripping the metal apart to make an armchair for a university library. It's deeply strange.
It is strange, but it's also a profound reflection of how society venerates history and how we try to capture the essence of survival. We have a deep psychological need to touch the past. Knowledge and history are most valuable when they are understood and actively applied to the present. By turning the broken, rotting hull of the Golden Hind into functional, everyday artifacts. A chair for scholars at Oxford to sit in while they study, a desk for young lawyers to sign their names on. They weren't destroying the ship.
They're repurposing it.
They were physically weaving the legacy of Elizabethan maritime adventure, that audacious spirit of survival against impossible odds, into the daily, functional lives of foundational English institutions. When a scholar sits in the Drake chair, they are theoretically absorbing the endurance and the intellect of that 36,000-mile voyage.
It's a way of keeping the ghost of the ship alive in the physical world. But as time went on, a few pieces of furniture simply weren't enough to satisfy the public's absolute obsession with this vessel. The story was too big. If the original wood was gone, if the original ship was lost to time, humanity decided they would just have to build a new one, or, as it turns out, several of them. And this is where the story of the Golden Hind takes on a very eerie, almost cursed quality in the modern era.
The attempt to resurrect this ship, to bring the legend back to life on the water, has been fraught with its own strange disasters and triumphs.
Let's walk through the replicas outlined in our sources, because the contrast between them is wild. The first major one is the Essex replica, constructed in 1947. It was built at Peter Pan's Playground, which is now an adventure park in Southend-on-Sea in Essex. It opened in 1949 alongside a waxworks, but from what I read, it wasn't built to sail. It was essentially a tourist trap. And by 1992, attendance had dropped, maintenance costs had skyrocketed, and the wooden structure was rotting just like the original did. So in 1997, it closed. It was eventually replaced by a replica of Blackbeard's ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, which itself was demolished in 2013. So that one just faded into sad obscurity.
But the next attempts are where the inherent danger of the ocean reasserts itself in a truly frightening way. The Devon replicas in Brixham.
This part of the research gave me absolute chills. The first Brixham replica was created in 1963. It was a converted fishing boat used for a TV series called Sir Francis Drake. It cost £25,000 to construct. It wasn't a perfect historical replica. It had no rear gallery or gun deck, but it looked the part on camera.
And its ultimate fate is a grim reminder that you cannot play act with the ocean. The sea does not care about television props.
Exactly. In 1987, while being towed in heavy seas to Dartmouth for restoration, this replica ship sank. It could not be saved. It went down into the freezing darkness of the English Channel. Decades after the original survived the absolute worst, most violent storms on the planet, its TV prop clone is swallowed by the sea just off the coast of England. It proves that the ocean is just as deadly, just as indifferent to human endeavor today as it was in the 16th century. The sea doesn't care if you are Francis Drake or a film crew. If you are vulnerable, if your ship isn't built to survive, the ocean will take you.
It is a terrifying modern echo of the original expedition's lost ships, like the Marigold. They did eventually replace it with a second replica in 1988, which still stands in the Brixham Harbor today, visited by thousands of tourists. But crucially, the sources note that this current vessel is based on a steel barge, is not full-size, and could never sail. It is permanently, safely shackled to the earth.
Which makes the final replica we need to discuss absolutely miraculous by comparison. The London replica, built in 1973.
The 1973 replica is an entirely different beast. This wasn't a converted fishing boat or a theme park prop built to sit in the mud. It was a true, full-size reconstruction, built using traditional 16th century methods in Appledore, Devon. It was the result of 3 solid years of painstaking historical research and masterful shipbuilding.
And this ship didn't just sit in a dock looking pretty, it took to the water. Our sources detail its incredible globe-trotting life. It sailed from Plymouth in late 1974 on a maiden voyage all the way to San Francisco, arriving in March 1975. In 1979, it sailed to Japan to film the famous Shogun miniseries. It circumnavigated the globe. It sailed around the British Isles, crossed the Atlantic to the Caribbean, passed through the Panama Canal to Vancouver for Expo 86, toured the U.S. coastal cities for years, and visited ports all over Europe.
The statistics are completely mind-bending. Since its launch, this 1973 replica has traveled more than 140,000 miles.
Let me just pause and repeat that. 140,000 miles. That is nearly 4 times the distance of the original Golden Hind's 36,000-mile voyage. Modern sailors actually took this 100-foot wooden galleon, a design meant for 1577, across the Pacific, across the Atlantic, facing modern storms in an ancient design, and survived.
And they did it successfully. Today, since 1996, she's been safely berthed in Bankside, Southwark in London, operating as an educational museum. But the wildly different fates of these replicas, one rotting in a theme park, one dragged to the bottom of the sea in a violent storm, and one conquering the globe, is absolutely fascinating.
There really is.
This raises an important question about authenticity and the nature of inanimate objects. We touched on the Ship of Theseus concept indirectly earlier with the Drake chair at Oxford. But look at the 1973 replica. It was built from scratch in the modern era. It shares no physical matter with Drake's original ship. Yet it has sailed 140,000 miles using traditional methods. The wood of that replica has absorbed the salt, the terror, the storms, and the sheer survival endurance of the world's oceans. Does that replica possess its own valid historical soul now? Does its physical experience on the water rival the original in maritime endurance?
That is a haunting thought. Does surviving the ocean, facing the abyss and returning, imbue a ship with a soul, regardless of what year it was built? It's almost as if the 1973 ship earned the right to be called the Golden Hind through trial by water. It bled for the name, which perfectly bridges us into the final, most lingering, and perhaps most disturbing aspect of the Golden Hind's legacy, the ghostly vision we started this deep dive with.
Yes, we return to the fog on the Devon coast.
According to modern folklore, the Golden Hind is not just a piece of furniture in Oxford, and it's not just an impressive replica in Southwark. It is a ghost ship. The tales, and there are many of them recorded over the years, suggest that the phantom ship appears in the thick fog of the English Channel, gliding silently through the freezing water.
Our sources describe this phenomenon as a spectral echo of its historic voyages. It is said to represent the immense tempests it survived, the massive treasure it carried, and the sheer audacity, the blood, the scurvy, the terror of Elizabethan maritime adventure. But I think we have to look at the psychological human element here. Why do people claim to see this specific ship?
Right. Why not the Mary Rose, which famously sank right in the Solent? Why not the Titanic? Why the Golden Hind? You have to imagine being a local on the Devon coast. The fog rolls in. The isolation drops over you like a wet, suffocating blanket. The ocean is roaring in the dark. Your mind starts to play tricks on you in the mist. And what does your subconscious conjure to make sense of that maritime dread? It conjures the ultimate symbol of oceanic survival and terror.
Critical thinking requires us to look at why legends endure. A ghost story isn't just a spooky tale told around a fire. It is a manifestation of collective memory. The Golden Hind was a vessel that quite literally changed the map of the world. It birthed the economic foundation of the British Empire. It carried a payload of silver so heavy it threatened to drag 80 men to their suffocating deaths in the deep Pacific. It survived storms that destroyed entire fleets and swallowed sister ships whole. Such immense historical weight, such concentrated human terror, triumph, and greed leaves a permanent scar on the cultural psyche.
It's like the event was so massive, so traumatic for the men involved, and so triumphant for the nation all at once, that history itself just can't fully digest it. It left a stain.
Precisely. The cultural psyche cannot let it go, so it manifests as ghost stories in the mist. The Phantom Ship isn't a literal wooden boat floating in the ether. It is the physical embodiment of England's ancient relationship with the terrifying, enriching, deadly ocean. Every time the fog rolls in, the memory of that 36,000-mile survival horror story resurfaces. The fear of the abyss returns.
It's a chilling thought to end on. As we wrap up this deep dive into the sources, let's quickly retrace the harrowing journey we've uncovered today. We started with a 120-ton wooden galleon, an 80-foot hull crammed with 80 terrified men sailing into an unmapped proxy war.
And we saw it survive a voyage of immense attrition, whittled down from 5 ships to just 1 as the ocean swallowed their friends.
We saw it capture the Spanish galleon, loading 26 tons of stolen silver into its belly, a payload of nearly £500 million that constantly threatened to drag them into the freezing abyss. We saw the 56 traumatized survivors limp back into Plymouth Harbor, their stolen wealth wiping out a national debt and birthing a global empire.
We watched the original ship rot into a museum exhibit, only to be carved up into library chairs and legal desks as holy relics.
We saw its clones suffer bizarre fates, from sinking in modern storms to sailing 140,000 miles across the modern globe. And finally, we saw it transform into a phantom, forever haunting the English Channel.
It is a legacy of sheer, stubborn, terrified survival against impossible, horrific odds. And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over. We are taught in history books that the Golden Hind is famous for being the first English ship to circumnavigate the globe and return home. A closed loop, a finished journey.
What is it?
Consider the reality of what we've discussed today. Pieces of its original wood still sit in Oxford, actively used by scholars. Its modern replica has sailed hundreds of thousands of miles, continuing to battle the oceans today. And its phantom is still reportedly seen in the freezing fog of the Devon coast, a silent shadow slipping through the water. When you look at all of that evidence, perhaps the true terrifying legacy of the Golden Hind is that its voyage never actually ended.
So the next time you find yourself standing on a foggy coastline, feeling the cold wind by your skin, staring out into the gray, silent void of the ocean, keep your eyes open. You never know what kind of history is still out there, surviving in the dark.